quickly. I work at Cognizant now. I worked at EMC last year. And I've also worked at Bell Canada. Bell Canada is a giant telco in Canada that was very much ITIL based. And I ran the cab as well as ran the operations teams. So I was involved in problems and incidents quite a bit.
And I'm Matt Schneider. I'm a chief architect with Dell Technologies. So I have the pleasure of working with many large customers, such as yourself, on their long-term strategic plans. I also run a team of enterprise architects that covers North and South America. Prior to joining Dell EMC about 18 months ago, I came from the customer side as well. So a lot of the things that we're going to talk about are both in our history as being in your guys' spot and plus working with a lot of customers. Which brings us to why we're here today and kind of a commitment that we'll make to you at the beginning of the session, right? So the reason that we're here, standing in front of you talking about DevOps and ITIL, which is not a product and it's not a service that we sell, although there's ways that we can help, really comes down to something Michael Dell said. When we stand at the center of the world's technology, we stand at the center of human progress. There's no place I'd rather be. This vision drives Dell Technologies. How do we make the world better? If you went to the keynote this morning, you heard that. So the reason I'm standing up here to share, right, what we've learned, what I've learned from customers, what I've learned myself, is simply to be helpful. That's it, right? No product, no pitches today, just what we're seeing in the field. How about you?
I too like being helpful. So at Cognizant, Cognizant's been a partner of Dell EMC for a long time. In the division I'm in digital engineering, we're a big partner with Pivotal because of Cloud Foundry. We find our customers are going through transformation, a digital transformation, and they know that digital transformation means they have to get better at writing software. But they don't know how. Whether it's because they don't have a software development team, like all the software they use has been retail software they've bought off the shelf, or they have a software development team, but it's got antiquated methodologies and they know that it doesn't move fast enough and they'd like to sort of leapfrog from where they are to moving as fast as a startup. So digital engineering helps with that. It's very much a learn by doing methodology, so we will come in, land a pod, develop some software, and you can learn how we do it and what processes we use and tools we use as we go.
So, like we said, we did this last year. So, I don't know if Tommy's in the room. So Tommy Trogdon sat down with Brian and I a year and a half ago now and asked us, hey, talking to lots of customers about DevOps and ITIL working together and hearing lots of things. Can we make a session for it? And we said, absolutely. And so most of these conversations normally happen at bars. So we're at a bar, like, what are we going to make the theme? Anyone fans of Stanley Kubrick in the room? Brian and I are big Kubrick fans. What's your favorite movie? 2001. 2001? What's yours? Same fun? Anyone else? Any Eyes Wide Shut fans? What's your favorite movie? 2001. So mine and Brian's happen to be Dr. Strangelove. So for some reason, probably the drinking thing, the session became themed around Dr. Strangelove, or DevOps and ITIL, how our CAD learned to stop wearing and trust TDD. As we progressed in the evening, the similarities didn't stop here. So tell me if this environment sounds similar to you guys. Have an operations team, many of us are infrastructure people, are sitting in the data center, taking care of your equipment, get a call from management, hey, I need to do a new release. Yeah, no problem, right? Put in a request for change. I think everyone said they have a CAD process. Everyone has some type of RFC form they fill out. So you send that form to the developers, and they go, what is this? Firewall rules, ports? Right? They don't know what to put in there. So they get frustrated, and they work through it. And then finally you get it together and you put it in front of the dreaded change advisory board. So I've run cabs, I've presented to cabs, I've sat on cabs, so I say this from sitting in the shoes, right? I see a lot of similar themes in these meetings. I see these folks. I have no clue how to code, but I approve this release. I see these, right? Kind of the battle scorn people, right? People that are used to the changes going wrong, and they go, how have you tested? How are you going to prevent what happened last time, right? And then I see this, right? Like, we already told the business that this was releasing. Like, there's no approval here. It's going out, right? This is the date, so we're going to call and we're going to escalate it. Change management team goes, fine, okay. We're approving it. Let's go check the schedule. Maybe a month. How long does it take? Is a month long enough? Is that how long it normally takes to put a change out, or is it longer? Anyone longer than a month? I know I was. Do you guys have change freezes? Anyone have a change freeze? right?
Yeah.
Around big holidays, right? I worked in retail, we froze everything from September through, the holidays, right? Christmas, and then we froze it again for year end. So you have all these things you have to intersect and find the little window. And because it takes so long, when it's finally time to release, the developers, I added a whole bunch of more code, there's more stuff, right? We had more to do. But they swear, don't worry, totally packaged up, the release and rollback, ready to go, all automated, super safe. And then deploy day comes. Anyone heard this? Hey, just this once, can you give me root? Just this once. It's super complicated, I want to deploy it myself. This is funny, but it's not. The reason that we have all these processes is because if it's big, if it's small, sometimes this happens, right? Your changes blow up, right? It's why we make the process, and it's why we kind of laugh at some of these things, right? And then once it blows up, you get into a war room. Anyone have a dedicated war room for their, yeah. Go try to fix the problem, right? Lots of monitors. Finally fix it, and then you put a post-mortem together. Try to figure out what happened. And then finally, you bring in a process consultant, right? It's going to tell you how to add more process and more rigor and more to this. So this is really the bleak world that it feels like we live in sometimes. And we hear DevOps at conferences, on YouTube. We see it in articles, and we're like, wow, that makes everything better. Everything's just magically better, right? And so we start trying to do some of these things that we hear about in DevOps, and the IT service management team or the ITIL team comes along and goes, no, I can't do that, right? The gentleman said it exactly, right? My cap says I can't do that. So that's really what we want to talk about today is that can we make it DevOps and ITIL? And we think that we can if you change your perspective. So Brian, what are our goals today?
Yeah, I'm excited. Let's dig into some meat of this. I think there are probably two different categories of people in the room today. I know we asked your roles earlier, but I think it kind of breaks down into there are the skeptics, either because they believe that DevOps is crazy, some kind of buzzword, and like it's never actually going to produce anything, or because they think ITIL is outdated and needs to be retired and not kept in any way, or the skeptics because look, they're both fine, but not together, right? They don't work together. So those are the skeptics. Or maybe you're a teacher. So maybe you're in there saying, I want this to be true. I really want it to be true because I know our company's moving to DevOps, but I know we have ITIL today, and if we can bring this together, then we'll be so much better off. Please enable me and help me. I would call you the teacher. So the goal today is just take you and move the needle a little. So if you are a skeptic, maybe sway you. Right? Maybe take you all the way to teacher, but I think at this point I'd be happy with just don't be an opponent to this idea. That would be a win for me at the end. And the teachers, we want to prepare you. And we want to prepare you in the sense that very little of this is our opinion. Matt's done a ton of research and a ton of reading, and so a lot of this comes from surveys, from some scientific research studies, and from books. And we had the links to all those in the slides. So you can get the slides afterwards and you can do further reading as you like. DevOps. I think the first thing to do when you're doing further reading is to find out the definitions of the terms, right? Because if we don't all have the same kind of definition of what we're talking about, then it's going to be very difficult for us to have a meaningful conversation. This is from Wikipedia, the definition of DevOps. And DevOps is not a tool, right, or a set of tools. DevOps is a culture. It's a culture that values having collaboration and communication, and it's supposed to result in having rapid, frequently released changes to your network. The key to doing this is the culture and not the tools. Right? Let's look at another definition of the same kind of thing. This one comes from Gartner. They are using the same terms. They're saying it's a culture that supports having a lean and agile team full of collaboration, results in programmable infrastructure, right? I think we introduced another term there, and these often get used together. DevOps, so it's agile, or DevOps, so it's lean. And so let's break down that again. So let's go to agile. Agile software, it's a set of principles. It's again supporting your culture, it's supporting the same kind of values, have a collaborative teams and adaptive and response to change. But the key here is to have these cross-functional teams. And we're going to have a lot on that in this session. But let's start with the manifesto for Agile. a number of software developers had decided that to codify it so we could have a common language we can talk to. And they wrote together this Agile manifesto, which is on probably one of the worst web pages in the world if you've ever gone and taken a look at it. Well, let's just focus in on the main middle part, right? What they're saying is we really value individuals and their interactions. And we value that more than processes and tools. Because individuals and their interactions is what creates the value in our business. The processes and tools support that value, right? In the same way, if we value working software over comprehensive documentation, it's not that documentation isn't useful, but it's the working software that returns the value to your business, right? So it's more valuable than the documentation. We also value customer collaboration rather than contract negotiation. And actually, I don't mind contract negotiation, but it's a slippery slope that leads to contract enforcement, and that I'm against. See, contracts are set up sort of assuming that the state will stay the same. We agree to do this, and we agree this is my responsibility and your responsibility, and things won't change. That is how they are. But that's not true. None of us own a crystal ball. Things that outside of either party can change and influence what is now, was a good contract and now is probably a bad contract. And if a customer comes to you and says, I'd like to change something, you shouldn't hear, I'm trying to get out of something. What you should hear is, it would be more valuable to me if it was different. And if your customer's saying, it's more valuable to me if, you should listen, right? So customer collaboration over top of that, contract negotiation. And the last one is responding to change instead of following a plan. You can follow a plan. Following a plan is a good idea, as long as you're responsive to the change. You can be like Blockbuster, say, they had a plan. Blockbuster was going to rent videos through VHS or DVDs or whatever directly to clients. They can return to a store. Netflix had a similar plan. We're going to rent DVDs, but we're going to do it over the mail, and we're not going to worry about late fees. But Netflix took that and responded to change. They made it a streaming service rather than something that's physical media. And then they changed again because they were just streaming other people's content, and they realized that if it became successful enough, those people with the content would make their own streaming service and it would put us out of business. So now they're a content creation company. And they do both, obviously. And so that responding to change is very useful. Following a plan, good until it's not good. So while there is value in those items on the right, which I'll call practices, there is more value in the items on the left.
We think that as you begin really looking at DevOps and how you integrate it in your enterprise, this has to be your focus. Principles and practices. And that the principles are always going to be more important than the practices and should drive your practices. Now, if we talk about software development, the principles are agile. That's what Brian talked about. The practice could be Scrum. It could be extreme programming. It could be the Microsoft Solutions Framework. It could be something as simple as your Kanban board. Right? Your principles drive how you act. We should know this already, right? You live by a set of principles. Whether they're religious, whether they're philosophical, you have a set of principles. And at the end of every day, you ask yourself, did I adhere to them? And if you're like me, every day you probably say no. But you shouldn't do that at work. What we think is important when we're talking about DevOps is, this is the same thing. DevOps is just a set of principles. And ITIL can be the practices behind it, if you want them to be. Now, there's other practices that you could put in, but that's not today's conversation. Today is DevOps and ITIL, right? So that's what we're going to talk about. So if this is the case, and DevOps are principles and ITIL are practices, what are the principles? So let's do the same thing. Let's talk about that manifesto, but let's apply it to ITIL, right? Organizational structure, we talk a lot about in ITIL. Culture, Brian called this out, the definition of DevOps is always rooted in culture. Culture is more important. Processes and procedures, super important, right? You can't exist without them, but automating those processes and procedures need to be more important. Policies and approvals, right? Super important. They keep on telling me that on my expense report, that policies are very important. But lean and always improving them is more important. SLAs and SLOs, again, we need them, right? We have them as we provide services to you guys. But measuring them, far more important. So many organizations out there say, yeah, I've got an SLO, and then you ask how you're doing on it. Like, oh, I don't know, I haven't measured that in a while. And then finally, Detailed documentation, just like the Agile Manifesto, we need documentation, right? Like we can't exist without it. But we need to share it. And when I say share it, it's more than just putting it on, a wiki or a SharePoint site. It means your documentation is understandable to your audience. So these are the principles we're going to suggest drive DevOps. And if you've been following the DevOps community, you probably have seen them. And again, we think that everything on the right is still important. We just want you to start looking at these principles to guide the decisions in your practices. So this is columns. Anyone familiar with columns, been following the DevOps movement? Yeah. There's nothing kind of new about this. We're not suggesting it, but we're saying use this as a driver on top of ITIL. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through each one of these, culture, automation, lean, measurement, sharing. We're going to pick some scabs a little bit about, CAB will be one of them, and try to show you that they can work together. So let's start with culture. Culture's really hard. Trying to drive your culture is even harder. Deciding where you want your culture to be, living inside culture is easy. I think one of the most important tools for you as team members, as leaders, to have in trying to affect your culture is to have a nomenclature, to have something you can talk to each other about and to be able to identify your culture. These are not new. Brian said it, we're going to stand on shoulders of giants. So in 1994, Dr. Westrom wrote this paper that was the topology of organizational culture. It's been getting used a lot in the DevOps movement. On the right-hand side, we have a pathological culture, or power-oriented. You see attributes like low cooperation, teams aren't working together. Messengers get shot, you took the system down, you're fighting. Responsibilities are shirked. How many people have been in a meeting with more than 10 people and no one left with action items? Like everyone's like, oh no, he was supposed to do that, or she was supposed to do that. That's shirking responsibilities. Bridging is discouraged. I don't want the teams working together. Hide your information. Failure leads to scapegoating. Again, we're gonna point out the people that are making things wrong. And then novelties in this document, are not trinkets. They're new ideas. They're improvements. They get crushed, right? Because if the person that comes up with the novelty is not the person with power, then it's irrelevant. As you move across the spectrum, you start getting into bureaucratic or rule-oriented culture. Modest cooperation. We just ignore messengers, right? We have narrow responsibilities. We see this a lot in IT. I'm the Windows admin. I'm the Windows admin for the e-commerce site, right? I'm the storage admin. Bridging's tolerated. You want to work together, that's fine, right? But we're not going to actively try to encourage it. Failure leads to justice, right? System went down. We're going to hold a tribunal. We're going to have evidence. Then we'll shoot you. Novelty leads to problems because all these rules. The new idea doesn't work within the rules, right? So we want to do the new ideas, but we can't get there because it doesn't comply with the rules. We have to change the rules. Finally, generative or performance-oriented, high cooperation. We're training messengers. How do you better say that, right? How do you better communicate that? Risks are shared. Notice we've changed from talking about responsibilities to risks. How you organize yourself in an org chart perspective is going to change depending on your company, your size. I'm not going to stand up and advocate like full stack developers or anything. That's up to you guys. What you can make sure to do is everyone leaves that room saying we win or fail together, right? That's sharing risks. That bridging is encouraged. Failure leads to inquiry. We're more worried about why it happened than who did it. And then finally, novelty implemented. So we're all kind of different organizations. We don't know each other. I always like to take a pulse. How many people in the room feel they're pathological organizations? Like think about your big IT department. Anyone? We normally don't see that, or people are afraid to admit it. How many people feel generally bureaucratic? Okay, so don't feel alone.
More than half.
Right, most people normally answer that. How many people feel they're in a generative IT department? Okay, a couple people didn't vote. How many people want to be in a generative IT department? That's everyone, right? What's important about this is to have this nomenclature, be able to talk to your peers, hey dude, I think you're being a little bit pathological, right? You share this with them. So the question we normally get is, okay, I'm standing up here and saying there is nothing in ITIL that tells you to be pathological or bureaucratic. It's not there, right? It's not in the documentation. That's your culture. But I wonder why many people have a bureaucratic culture when they implement ITIL. What do you think, Brian?
I have a few ideas.
You do?
Yeah.
You guys want to hear them?
I see people taking pictures, which I think is great. You can continue to take pictures. Even if we're in it, you can like tweet those out and share them all you want. You can also email us or afterwards get the deck directly. If you can't find it online, you can find us and we will send it to you. So take as many pictures as you like. If they don't turn out great, just come find us. These, if you're in ITIL at all, you would probably have recognized already, the main pillars, right? How many people had this guide and turned it into an org chart?
We did when I was on the.
Right? You got your VP of strategy, right? You've got a whole design team. Operations sits somewhere separate, and even in operations, you sort of org chart that out too, right? Because you have a separate storage team versus a server team versus a network team. The problem is that any organization that employs humans will have communication inside the team much greater than communication outside the team, right? This is it's not intentional. It's just that you sort of build like a team distribution list. So email goes to the whole team, but doesn't go to the whole company. You wouldn't want all email to go to the whole company anyway. You have a team meeting, but you don't have like this person over here and that person and that person. You have your team as a meeting, right? So that you may even sit together. So either at a cubicle farm or some kind of area, you're all on the same floor, and so you can bump into each other and have lunch and stuff together. So the communication is within your team, which means that the result is, even if it's not intentional, is you build these barriers between teams. And when you do this, you're affected by something called Conway's Law. So Melvin Conway, back in the 60s, did some research, and they came to the conclusion that any organization that builds a system of any kind will have the system as a reflection of their organization's communication structure. So if you want some examples, if you had like 3 different teams and they were geographically split and you were building a compiler, you would end up with a 3-pass compiler. Never 2, never 1, you'd end up with a 3-pass compiler. If you had separate ops teams where you have a storage guys and a network guys and server guys or whatever, you end up with storage capacity management, network capacity management tools, server capacity management tools. It's very rare if you have them the same, because the team sort of builds their own to function on their own. That's not super efficient. You don't have to have, again, it's not an ITIL to say that this must be your org chart, right? That's your culture, that's how you've implemented it. I would suggest that whenever you're building anything, you're building some kind of product, the resulting team is actually going to be cross-functional anyway, right? So if you're whatever it is you're releasing in the network is going to need people from storage, from servers, from network, from wherever. And we've built these up because we think we have, we need expertise in each of these areas, right? We have server guys who have like 501 level knowledge of server stuff. We've got storage guys with 501 level knowledge. And as you get kind of more complicated and in larger organizations, you end up with even more divisions. So now instead of having a storage and network, you have a storage network and network, right? Does anybody have these kind of splits, the sort of micro-segmentations? Yeah. So what you end up is when you have this team, that's sort of a cross-functional team, you end up with like 57 people on there. I would submit to you that that's not good. Let me give you an example. Let's say I had, we have a product, we were going to market that product, right? In one side, if we had a team of like 3 people, we got a fixed budget and we know what our customer base is, we could probably come up with an advertising plan in a day, maybe a few hours. You're gonna look and say, well, we're gonna do it online, and we're gonna do it in radio, whatever we're gonna do, and figure out, make a decision and go. If we've got 57 teams of different expertise, and we've got an expert on SEO, we got another expert on like product placement and shows, we got another expert on radio, another expert on TV, another expert on newspaper. Are you gonna come to a conclusion in a day? Almost certainly not, right? This might take a month. So the larger the team and the more number of experts on the team and the 501 level difficulty tends to slow down your execution. But I would, your response is probably, that's great, but I can't just have 3 people because I don't have superhumans, right? They're hard to hire. And there's nobody that can have a 501 level expert in the whole thing. I agree, but let's walk through this. So let's say you're a new person, you're in this cross-functional team, and it's a small team, and you've got your own kind of skill set that you bring to it, and as you build and grow, as you're building the product, you grow your skill set, it gets more deep. And it continues to get deep, it also tends to get wider. You start to understand who's on which side of you and gain some of those skills as well. And you start to become broader skilled as well as deeper skilled. And then you end up looking like this, and you're like, Brian, wait, you told me there aren't any superhumans. And I agree, so we should just extract away the complexity. What we should do is automate the most difficult parts. And again, I'll get responses saying, like, you can't automate the difficult parts. What you automate is the easy and repetitive things, right? The things that you can really well define and really well understand that never really change. You automate those because the difficult parts is what we have humans for. I totally disagree. I mean, you can automate the easy stuff too, but it's only through automating the difficult that we get advancement. At one time when we wrote computer programs, we had to do an assembler. Has anybody wrote in an assembler before? I'm sorry for you, right? That you have to understand like the actual architecture of the processor that you're targeting, right? You have memory registers, and so you're pushing in the right spot, and remember the push and pop and whatever. And along came this wonderful thing called a compiler. And we could write in English like C. And we could write in C, and it can compile to a variety of different architectures, and I no longer have to worry about those particular details of the chip. And now actually, the blossoming of lots more applications get written because it's a lot easier to write applications. Take that forward, and now we have, whether it's interpreted languages like Perl or Python or Ruby, maybe with other compiled languages like Go, it's even easier than C, where we don't have to do as much memory management or anything anymore. It's now again wider, and it's easier to write software. We have explosion of new software. Another example, maybe more to this audience, has anybody created a bin file for a Symmetrix? Again, I'm sorry for you. And a Symmetrix is a large storage system, and you had to like really understand the details of the disk to understand the sectors and heads and things. And if you want to carve out your RAID, you have to understand, build your own parity. Like, most people just don't touch the bin file because it's really complicated. Today, if you want, like, just give me 300 gigs of RAID 5, done, right? You don't have to have all that detail. Extracting away the complicated parts allows people to get broader instead of having to be so deep, and it enables you to have a smaller cross-functional team.
So let's wrap up culture. Couple key points to leave with, right? Generative culture can exist within ITIL, right? There's nothing in that documentation that says that you need to be bureaucratic or pathological. You need to identify where process pain points are due to that culture. So the things that we're talking about, whether it's Westrom or whether it's, hey, I'm holding on, right, to like my archaic way of doing things because I don't want to leverage the abstracted simplicity. Identify those are cultural things. Talk about them as cultural things. Don't blame ITIL. Don't blame the tools, right? Don't blame the people either, but hold them accountable, right? Realize. Use the principles of Agile and DevOps to really ask yourself, right, am I doing comms and am I doing Agile, right, when I implement some of these practices, right? It will help you kind of open up your culture a little. Speak openly about the way you can improve, and then learn your surrounding skill sets, right? The skills on that product lifecycle. The more that you know about what comes before you and the more that you know about what comes after you, the more you empathize with the people that are handing you work and the people that you are handing work. And the more that you can relate with them, right? So we talked about, hey, my team is just talking to myself, but I hand it over, right? I'm a developer, but I'm handing it over to operations. Go find out those ops people. Get to know them. Get to know what pains there are, and vice versa, right? If you're the ops people, go talk to the dev people, right? Like, what's your life like? The more that you understand them, the more you can improve your culture. If you want to do one thing to improve your culture, and I work with a lot of customers that have started doing this and have just seen the benefit, just go start a book club. Right? Break all the email rules and send a big giant email to all of IT and say, hey, I'm going to start a book club. We're going to work on some DevOps stuff together. I want to improve the culture. Anyone that wants to join me, I'll be in the cafeteria at noon on the first Tuesday of the month. Right? Some books I would recommend starting with. These are not IT books. These are not DevOps books. These are culture books. 5 Dysfunctions of the Team, High Five, and Gung Ho. If you read one, read Gung Ho. Right? Take an active role in your culture. It is the cornerstone of DevOps. So comms, culture, automation, lean measurement, sharing. Automation is next. This is what most people actually think about when they think about DevOps, I think. They think, I'm going to automate things, and I need to automate everything. And as soon as they say, I'm going to automate everything, then they start going, that's going to be really hard. Where do I start? And then they go Google DevOps and automation, and they find the DevOps tool chain. Anyone seen this? Yeah. So tools that are kind of aligned to one of the major phases. They start working on this, and this is what I see. I see almost everyone when they start this effort, pick one out and say, I'm going to automate release. Anyone done that? Okay, I just want to automate release. Why? Because of CAB. right? Because of the pain that exists there. So I want to take care of this first. So you go to automate release, go to your cab and say, hey, I'm going to automate this. And what do they say? No. They say, no, we can't automate that. We've got processes. It's idle. Like that's how it works. So let's work through some ways to move this forward in your org. I think the first thing that is always important when you're working on some bureaucratic things is to, if you're going to practice law, know the law, right? So no idle and no change management. Let's read this, like break the rules of presenting. We're going to read what's on the screen. The goal of change management process is to ensure that standardized methods and procedures are used for efficient and prompt handling of all changes in order to minimize impact of change-related incidents upon service quality and consequently improve the org. When you read this with a bureaucratic or a pathological mindset, you read this, all changes. Right? You feel it, because that's all, oh no, everything goes through me. I'm the cab, right? I have to prove it all. But what about this, like just creating a LUN? Nope, that's cab. What about just adding a user? Nope, that's cab. Right? I mean, that's the bureaucratic mindset. If you reread this, put a generative cap on, I read something different. I read, ensure that standardized methods are used. What's more standard than something automated? Minimize the impact of change-related incidents on service quality. What's going to be better at preventing an outage than making it repeatable? What's better at repeating than automating? And then finally, improve the day-to-day ops of the org. This means you. This doesn't mean your product. This doesn't mean your service. Improve the day-to-day ops of the people. What's a better way to improve my life than to automate the things, right, that are repetitive, that I do all the time? The answer to the definition that was written for idle change management is automation, without a doubt. You just have to read it correctly. So go back to your cab next week, tell them that, and what do you think they're going to say? No. That's right. So let's dig in more. 3 types of changes. This is in the idle handbook. Normal, standard, emergency. How many people are doing all 3? Okay, good. So we're not going to talk about emergency. Hopefully you never have those. We know you do. So normal, you got to follow the process all the time. From the beginning to the end, you should assume the impact of these changes to the business are significant until you prove otherwise. That feels a little bit bureaucratic. And then you get into this, if the changes are low or insignificant, you can follow the standard change procedure. When I first read this, probably 15 years ago, I went to the change management team and I said, what is this standard? They're like, oh, we don't do that. Or we do very little of it. So let's look at the standard. Standard changes are often pre-authorized. Like it's the first thing. Pre-authorized means I don't need to go to CAB. They represent low-risk common activities with a known outcome. What is a better example of low-risk common activities with a known outcome than automation? Right? This is the key, right? If you want to start adopting the principles of DevOps in a culture that has change advisory board, is focus on standards. Don't try to get rid of CAB. There are so many people I see that are fighting it, saying, I'm going to go around you, CAB, and then they're running into audit issues, they're running into security issues, they're running into all these problems because CAB does serve a purpose, as much as you might dislike it. Automate it, go back to the meeting and get the standard. So the question becomes, will that work with your CAB? Good. Some people say yes.
I see a nodding.
Most people still probably say no, because we need to prove to CAB that it's low impact. So the question becomes, how do we prove it's low impact?
Again, I have ideas.
You do?
Yeah.
I've heard them before.
So at Bell Canada, we started where everybody starts, at release. I think I'm past the statute of limitations now, so I can talk about an incident. We had a change. The engineer created the change and did not test it, and then gave it to an implementation engineer who scripted it. And made a small change to the core routers, was to make to all core routers. The only problem with the change is when you made it, the router stopped talking on all external communication. So basically turned from a router into more like a brick. If you were to do this even once, whether it's in a lab or on the production, you would know right away, because as soon as you made the change, the router doesn't talk to you anymore. So you would stop and you would fix it and you would not go any farther. But automation, no, that doesn't care. That just keeps going router after router after router and turning really wonderful routers into really pretty expensive bricks. Thankfully, the alarms all went off and he was able to cancel it before it got too far, only a couple hundred routers, which all have dial-in access, but that made for an awfully painful night weekend, month, I think. I mean, it was back up that night, but the whole fallout from that was crazy painful. That's not a really good place to start your automation journey. I would suggest you start here at create. What you first should do is we're going to write any kind of code in order to implement some sort of a new feature, or if you're thinking of infrastructure as code, even to make a change in the existing network. What you should think about is documenting the request for it in the form of a user story. As a user, I'd like to do whatever so that I can achieve some sort of result. Who's asking for that request? What are the success criteria? How are we going to test it? Whatever. Write that down as a user story. And then track your code to that user story. This is a beginning of traceability, which we'll cover again later. The next thing you should do is have security as part of that. So when you're going to write some code, security should not be some downstream effort, because if it's a downstream effort and it's caught later, there's only a chance it's going to caught later. And then even if it is, it's got to come back, it's got to be rewritten. Why not just do it right the first time? So the best way to do that is to have automated testing of your security policies. So as soon as a developer checks it in, it gets instant feedback and you can do it right the first time. And to build in sort of failure alerts. So every time that you commit some code, you should run some testing on that code so that the developer gets instant feedback. Instant feedback is key. If I just wrote some code and I instantly found out it failed, it's really easy to fix it. I mean, it might still be difficult to fix, but at least I know what it is, I know where it is, I've got all the variables are still in my head, I still have the thing up on my screen. If I write some code and I find out 6 months later that there's a problem with it, I gotta go back to my notes if I made some. I gotta start reading code. It's way more difficult to fix. And at best, I'm just guessing at what I was doing before. So quick feedback is super key. You need to verify it. So you should deploy that code to some sort of production-like testbed. Production-like, it doesn't have to be exact replica of production. Probably the scale is the biggest thing to vary. But it does have to be the same thing as production. So if you're gonna test, if production is on Oracle, your testbed shouldn't be on MySQL. Not that either one is good or bad, it's just that you have to test what you're gonna deploy. And actually the same version, if you were deploying on MySQL in production, but a different version in your test system, then you're not really testing. Because there's something that's changed between those two versions. I don't know what it is. Maybe it'll affect your application, maybe it won't. But it's kind of like a time bomb. And why do you want to plant time bombs in your network?
You should have the unit test.
Yeah. So the next session is, the next line there is the acceptance, regression, and performance testing, and exactly that. I think the best way to go through this is test-driven development. And in test-driven development, you would say, I'm going to write a test first. And the test should fail, and it should fail in exactly the right way. And then I will write some code, and only enough code to make that test go green. And if the simplest thing I can do is like return true and the test goes green, I need to write more tests, right? So you always want to do the simplest thing, make the test go green, and then write some more tests, make the test go green, write some more tests. Unit tests, integration tests, API tests. So they can always be executed and you can get that quick feedback. The next thing is to populate your request for change. So if we're actually doing some unit testing where we have this tied back to a user story, we've pushed it out to a production-like system, then most of the fields, if not all of the fields in that request for change can probably be pre-populated, right? So we should do that, have them automatically pre-populated. We should also stage the deployment and rollback. Like going forward and going back should be as simple as camera 1, camera 2. Like you push a button and it deploys whatever it is you want to deploy. If you have the right kind of automation, you can do that. The next thing is you should log the change, right? So when you actually go to make the change, it should say this changed on this system, as executed by this person on this time, so that if you do have an incident, you have something to go back to and understand what changed. Automate the actual deployment after approval. And it's okay if you're trying to automate and you need to have some manual steps in here, right? Because eventually at the end you want to be all automated, but if you want to have the manual approval for a long time, totally fine. Just know that the end goal is to automate that, but it might take a long transition period. The next thing is the CMDB. So the way I see most organizations is that there's CMDB, like all CMDBs have this line of None of them are 100% accurate, right? Does anybody have a CMDB that's 100% accurate? No. But there's always this line of like, if it was any less accurate, it would be totally useless, because I wouldn't know if it was right or wrong, right? So I don't know what that is, like 80%, and everybody's CMDB seems to be like 82. Like just north of the line of like, it's probably right. I usually trust it, but not always. Imagine if you could automate that update of that CMDB so that it was accurate all the time. Someone makes a change, the database is updated. And then, again, an example from Bell. So automate turning on of monitoring. So we had deployed a router. It went well. Nothing happened on this router for 6 months. Then there was a failure, which we didn't know about, because it turned out the whole time nobody turned on monitoring. So nobody was watching whether there'd be a failure or not. That's not good. But if you have a system, again, that has humans will miss things occasionally. And so if you don't have some automated system to either A, turn it on when it needs to be turned on, or B, check to make sure that all the discoverable devices are also in your monitoring system, it's just a time bomb. It's just eventually going to bite you.
We call it something like smoke tests.
Yep.
Which are usually predefined before deployment. So as soon as it happens, like this is like the early detection system.
Sure. Yeah, so if you couldn't hear, he was talking about smoke tests. So it's a very common thing to do a smoke test. So put it in. So what I like is when you separate release from deploy. So we release it, it's in production, but there's no active traffic to it yet. And now I can do all kinds of testing like in production. Not like stress testing maybe, but you can do the rest of the kind of testing to make sure that it would be valid and it would work and that the monitoring systems and everything else are good. And only if all passes, then you can flip the bits and the production switches to the new version. And finally now, if we do have an incident, we get to tie that all the way back up the chain. Imagine the power of understanding that an incident was related to what user story that asked for that feature in the first place. And how you can enable your organization to learn quicker and to adapt quicker and to make the right decisions if you have the knowledge of that whole system rather than just guesswork. So automate all the things, right? This is kind of a buzzword, and usually when you hear it first, it's like, automate all the things, that's crazy. But it's crazy, and it happens to be a really good advice. That the more automation you have across the whole network, the more likely you will have success.
I think the key to this, right, as we talk through all the different automation is keep in mind everyone needs to benefit, right? When we focus just on release, we're focusing on just one aspect of where the benefit is. When we focus on all the phases, then every team member benefits, and then everyone should be automating together, right? Because then that sounded like a lot of work that Brian talked about, but if you break that up between all the teams and you make a culture of automation, and all the teams are trying to work towards that common goal, right, then you can reach there much faster. So wrapping up automation, right, it's easier to automate a defined process, right? The processes that come from ITIL will help you do that automation. You should have, if you're a mature ITIL organization, you probably have workflows, you probably have diagrams. There's your automation base. Go start with that. You know what good looks like. You just need to have a computer do it. Leverage the standard change, as we talked about, right? If you automated all those things that Brian talked about, and the very last thing was showing up to CAB and saying, hey, the request for change was populated, and as soon as you say yes, then I'm just going to hit a button and it's going to deploy on a schedule, then that's a compelling conversation with CAB to go, why am I still asking a human for approval? Yes?
You made a recommendation earlier that was to automate what was complex and what was difficult.
Yep.
Yet, usually what's complex and difficult isn't not as well defined and requires heuristics, things like that.
Yeah.
How could you contrast that?
We can, yeah, I'll take 1 minute and we can talk about it afterwards, but there are lots of tools that can help. So the way we automated it, moving from assembler to something better, was to have a compiler. So something like release automation. I mean, if your target platform is Cloud Foundry and you can do red-green deploys or blue-green, depending on what you call it, or canary deploys or things like that, it makes it a lot easier. So I would say that the automation goes through the complicated parts as well as it goes through the easy parts.
I would say the point is don't shy away from the difficult automation, right? Sometimes you need to take care of the little things. These are good examples, right? Automated provision, self-service incident resolution. The automation belongs in all the different areas. You save yourself some time by automating the easy things to then go tackle. Don't stop at just the easy things, which some people do. Some books to read for your book club. Hopefully you've got one started and you've made it through the culture books. Test-Driven Development by Ken Beck. Even if you're on the operations infrastructure side, understand TDD. right? Because that's a conversation you can have with your development team. And as you start doing infrastructure as code, you can apply it to yourselves in infrastructure. Best practice insights. So this is just the BMC book. I chose it because it's free. It focused on the ITIL service transition. I'm not extolling them as a product. The point is, again, if you're going to be a lawyer, know the law, right? And people are telling you, I'm sorry, you can't do that because of X policy. Whip out the book and say, show me where it says I can't automate it, as long as I have the right approvals and as long as I can show you it's low impact. And then finally, continuous delivery. This has become the Bible on CI/CD, continuous delivery, continuous integration by Jez Humble and David Farley. So good books to read as your book club, be able to learn. So calms, culture, automation, lean. We're picking these scabs, right? Is there anything in ITIL that says you cannot be lean, which is mean to continually improve? Anyone that answers yes is in the wrong session. Of course there isn't. Not only is there isn't, it's in ITIL. It's been there since 07. It's in V3. So it's the lean software development process, making things better, continually looking at them. It's this continual improvement off to the side. Again, like Brian said, we've often made a department that said, hey, you're in charge of continual improvement. And it doesn't belong. You can have a department be kind of the holder of it, maybe, but it needs to exist across everything, right? The ITIL process, continual improvement of identify, define, gather, process, analyze, present is a loop, and it needs to include everyone, right? So it's baked in, right? There's lots of people in IT service management that says, no, that's how it works. We can't make it better, but that's not what the ITIL stuff is installing. So that was easy, right? There's no conflict there. It's in V3. The functions, everything should be under continual improvement, whether it's service transition, whether it's operations, whether it's capacity management. 3 books for your book club. Again, if you're going to be a lawyer, know the law. So the continual service improvement, go read it. I'm not going to advocate this is the only way to do lean. You can do Six Sigma, Demerit, you can do anything. But it's in, right, the core beliefs of ITIL. The Toyota Kata, right, the Bible, if you haven't read the Kata, right, where lean manufacturing and then lean software development really grew out of Toyota. And then a final book that has nothing to do with continual improvement and nothing to do with IT called Blink. Anyone read Malcolm Gladwell? Yeah. The reason I put this up here is because I think when you start focusing on continuous improvement, your instinct is the best way. Because you're sitting in a meeting and you go, why are we doing this? Like, we all say it, but we all say it to ourselves. Blink is about trusting your instinct. Trust that instinct when you're like, man, this is overly bureaucratic. Use the word, right? Change your culture, go change the process. So culture, automation, lean, measurement. So measurement. Does ITIL say you can't measure? Of course not. Capacity management is about measuring. Incident management is about measuring. Like, ITIL has all of these measurements built in, right? It's part of the kind of what it was built to do. Same thing that DevOps is saying. If you get tools off the shelf, again, not saying these are the right tools, but they have all these measurements built in. So we measure, right, kind of the service operations, and ITIL has lots of measurements. What we're often missing is, again, back to DevOps as the full chain, right, from the creation out to the deployment. We miss some of the other measurements that need to exist and how to measure DevOps.
Yes. How do you measure DevOps? It's funny because it's a culture. How do you measure a culture, essentially, right? So there's 4 that I would recommend that you look at. The first one I really like, it's kind of a magic measurement because you can't get better at this without getting better at a whole bunch of other things, and it's your deployment frequency. So many people would look at that as an initial thing to move, but you don't tackle it directly. You tackle it by it's a reflection of your culture and how well it's executing. It's very closely tied to the next one, which is lead time to change. So lead time is not like request for change. It's when a developer says it's ready, it's codes commit, then the investment in creating that feature has been paid, right? But you don't get the return until it's in production. So measure that time between investment made and return in production, and try to understand why it's so long and how to shorten it. The next one is mean time to recover. I think we know this one. How do we get better at recovery from failure when it does happen? And the last one is the change failure rate, which always should be driven towards 0. The Puppet did a State of the DevOps report. They surveyed many customers. They took all the findings and they brought it back and they analyzed it and they grouped them basically into 3 different categories: high, medium, and low performers. So like the high are really performing DevOps well and throughout, and the low performers are doing it much less. And how are they doing on these three different categories? Well, the first one, the deployment frequency, the low performers are measured in months, right? Many are doing semi-annual releases and things like that. If you were to look towards the high performers, the change is done on demand. So as soon as a developer has said, the code's complete, it passed all our tests, we should push it directly to production, right? So we should really shrink that time of like investment paid to return being paid. The next one is the lead time for changes. So again, similar kind of concept you would see in months for somebody who's a low performer, and I don't know, maybe under an hour. Like how long does it take for the computers to run all the tests before you're confident you can push it out to production? And then that obviously means it's also being done during the day, right? You can do this kind of changes at any time if you understand what the impacts are to your network and the ability to roll back. The mean time to repair, even for the low performers, is under a day. I mean, it really should be, right? Like if your mean time to repair, average time to repair is not under a day, I don't know how you're still in business. So that's pretty normal. But if you look down to the high performers, it's much, much less. Like the average is under an hour. The interesting number, though, the one that really stands out for me is that change failure rate. If you notice, the low performers are in the like 16 to 30%, and that's not good, but it's not terrible. And as you switch to a medium performer, it gets worse, right? And that may sound bad at first, and it is bad because the medium performers, that's not a good destination to be, right? You're not hoping to become a medium performer. It's a state of transition. So when you're in that transition, maybe you have some automation, but you don't have all your automation yet. Like we're automating the release to the production, but we don't have TDD on all the code that we've written. It could be painful. It could be hard. Or maybe you're just not good at it yet, right? You're developing a new skill, and you just don't know how to make the changes in this new world. If you look at the high performers, you can see that it's definitely worth it, right? The high performers at 0 to 15%, I mean, the worst of the high performer is better than the best of the low performer. And many of these high performers are actually, at or near zero. So there are no changes that cause failures in the network. This is definitely the destination you want to get to. What it means to me, though, is that means you have to have the right kind of acknowledgement and investment up front. Things will get worse before they get better. If the first step you make and it gets a little worse and your executives are like, no, forget that. Like, we cannot get worse. We're going the wrong direction. We should stop and roll back. Then you can't get through to the high performance, right? So understand that you're going to need some investment. You're going to need some sustained investment in order to push through that hump. But does it matter, right? Like, okay, so we release faster. Like, like, why are we doing all this? Does it really make a difference? How do you measure the value of culture? It's super difficult to do, although we have one way that I think works. There's a measurement called the ENPS, or the Employee Net Promoter Score. It essentially asks two questions, right? Like, how likely are you to recommend your organization, or how likely are you to recommend your team? It turns out that high performers have a significantly higher ENPS. And does it matter? Does it help if you have a higher ENPS? Definitely. Other studies listed here, like the Chemistry of Enthusiasm, has found that if you have a higher ENPS, you have higher revenue growth. If you have a higher NPS, you have a higher stock market valuation, right? The stock market goes up higher. This is real financial returns. There's another study that's done by the Hay Group. They found the same kind of study. They found out different numbers. They said if you have a higher ENPS, you have better employee performance. If you have a higher NPS, you have much less turnover, right? You have a better employee retention. I mean, that makes sense. We're sort of asking how likely are you to recommend your organization or your team as a place to work. So if you didn't, that would be. But that makes a difference to the company. And who wants to work in a place where your best people are leaving all the time, right? Nobody wants to work there. So it sort of feeds on itself. There is a significant difference in customer satisfaction amongst companies in similar industries, similar products, one with low NPS, one with a high NPS. Customer satisfaction on the high NPS much higher. People like coming to work, they like dealing with their customers, people like working with people who like being at work. And again, they found the same kind of thing, huge financial success for companies who have a higher NPS.
So they comment that the meetings will continue until the morale improves. It's something we all like to laugh about. We put little memes up when it gets bad. But this is real data you can take back to your organization and say, hey, we need to focus on culture, right? We can measure it, go do NPS now. I mean, it's 2 questions on a 1 to 10 scale. It's
Yep.
not hard. Like SurveyMonkey will do it in a minute. Start measuring it so you can see it improve and use this data back, with your boss, with your financial team, with your CFO to be like, look, it's worth the investment because you'll make money. So let's wrap up measurement, right? You get what you measure, right? Make sure you have these measurements in place.
And do them actually now, right? Do them before you start to make changes.
Yes, please, right? Because the people that are already on the journey, right, they didn't know how bad it was when they started. Both DevOps and ITIL have a strong measurement base. Embody that generative culture. Remember that hump, right? Like anytime you make a change, it's going to feel like things got worse because in some ways it did, right? But see it through because the other side is better. Measure purpose, principles, and practices. So a couple books, right? Public State of the DevOps Report. These are all out online. Read them. Great data. We summarize them, but more in there. Software development metrics, right? We talked a lot about measuring the end-to-end. We talked about measuring kind of the ITIL infrastructure thing. Lots of shops that I see in the enterprise space don't do a great job of measuring software development, right? So it's an area to work on it. Again, even if you're in ops and infrastructure, read the book so you can talk to your developers about, how are you doing this? How are you doing TDD? How are you measuring it? And then if you're a mather, like if you really geek out on the math, this is an interesting book called Guerrilla Capacity Planning. The reason I bring it up is because it has great equations for relating these metrics. And so you, at a mature level, you want to be able to relate things like NPS to eNPS back to your infrastructure data, right? Because you will start seeing a correlation. And when you can show that correlation is when you can show the value of the whole team. So comms, culture automation, lean measurement, sharing. Man, there's nothing in ITIL that says don't share, right? Like there's lots of people that say that. I have the ITSM team tells me that you can't share that. It's one of the foundations. It's the knowledge management foundation, the inside of ITIL. Like it talks about sharing. It talks about how to set up sharing. There's no conflict there. So these are kind of some key areas on each one of the cultures, the principles that we talked about. Hopefully we've shown you that using comms, right? It's not DevOps against ITIL, right? But comms can be this bridge to bring them together and that they will work together. And if you don't believe Brian and I, how many people have read The Phoenix Project? If you haven't, that's the first book for your book club to read.
That's right.
But even Jin Kim, who was one of the writers of it, said, hey, ITIL and DevOps will work together, right? Like this is something that we need to break through, this stigma that one's bad and one's good, right? Generative cultures will make both good. So a couple other sessions for you guys that are here the rest of the week. There's a session tomorrow on cloud apps. We get a little bit more into principle or into practices, right? Because ITIL is not the only practice. So this again on Wednesday, if you want to see it again.
Tell your friends.
Bring your friends, bring your boss. And then 2 other DevOps sessions that we have. One's kind of 9 crucial steps, another one's a story from VMware about their journey. Please fill out your surveys. We really like them. And then in the theme of the movie again, this is for Tommy. The end. Here's the link. It's super easy. bit.ly, DevOps, ITIL. If you want the deck, go download it. It's all out there.